Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about book-adjacent things. And today we're going to talk about different approaches to writing, different approaches to reading, and why the one that is currently very popular and sells really well does have some bad side effects. I may even bring up an anecdote from a metal festival in between. We'll just do all of that, shall we? And before we do that, I want to thank one of my Patreon backers, and that's Rupert. Thank you, my friend. This one's for you. Cheers. If you want to get a personal cheers, well, there's a Patreon down below. I would very, very much appreciate that. Every little helps. I'm a poor fucker out here, but you don't have to. Don't worry. All right, let's talk about something here that is important to me, and that I think we need to talk about some more, and that is how books are written and how something has happened over the last, say, 50-ish years, 55 years. All right? And to do that, we're going to start with a bit of Death of the Author, because you can always do that, alright? Death of the Author, Roland Barthes, it's out there since 1967, 1968, depending on whether you read the English or the German version. Not German version, the French version, of course, which is the older one. And yeah, we're not going to go too deeply into the whole thing, but basically the idea is an interpretation, meaning of a text is established at the point of reading, not at the point of writing. Everyone can make their own mind up about what is written in a book. And, you know, there's more to it. That's what we need to talk about for today. It's like meaning is created at the point of reading. So when you pick up a book, whatever it means to you, that's the correct interpretation of that text for you in that situation. Why did Barthes write that? Well, there's, a lot of aspects to that, but one that I think is important here is the idea of taking down authorities. It's part of the whole, postmodernist, post-structuralist approach. A lot of his, contemporaries, you have, people like Michel Foucault, are sort of in the same business of taking down authorities, questioning them, or, dismantling them if possible. And I do tend to agree with that. It's a good idea. Take down authorities, it's always a good idea. Anyway, so we have that, and it does for a while change how we read books. It does also, for a while, change how some people write books, because, some authors go yeah, maybe he's got a point there, in a way. Maybe Barthes has a point. And if I make my one meaning too clear, that may just mean that every interpretation is the same, and we lose something in that. Because, and this is important, reading books can be treated, is often treated like communication. There is an aspect to art that is communication, which means we take a text and we assume there is a meaning in there. Not only do we assume there is a meaning in there, we assume that there is one correct meaning in there, because that's how we treat communication, right? I yell something at you, and at the end of the day, we can agree on whether you got what I told you or you didn't. That's how communication works, but art is slightly different. And that's sort of the big problem that we have with books, because they're written. It's written language. It's very explicit compared to, say, music or paintings or sculpture or even film. A written book reads like a letter or an email from your boss, possibly. And those, you try to figure out the one true meaning. Well, that's not what we should do, because there's more than one true meaning in there. There's, of course, whatever the author wanted to say when they sat down to actually write the damn thing. But is that the one correct meaning? Barthes says no. And some authors are like, y'all got a point there. So what can we do to make that obvious to the reader? And there's one really easy way to do that, and that is obscure the one true meaning. Make the reading experience something else than just following one line of an argument. And that is, of course, when you're reading fiction, and that's what we're talking about here. If you want to make one specific point, you write a political pamphlet, and that's fine. You write a political essay, you write a political book, those are absolutely great. Go write a communist manifesto if you want to. That's perfect. But if you're writing fiction, it's different. So we come into the wonderful world of postmodern and post-structuralist fiction, where authors explore all of these things. Some of them just like go and fuck with all the rules because they want to see how far they can bend the rules, how far they can go before they break the rules. And some, in general, create these labyrinth novels where basically you can end up on all kinds of weird paths with your own meaning at the end, because the book is no longer that clear structured. And that's just a good thing if you believe in the fact that we should build our own meaning out of what we consume when we consume art. And, fantasy literature at some point got there as well. Like, fantasy and science fiction is always a bit slower than your literary fiction. I don't want to call it capital L literature because that's a different term, but, not a good term either. But, it takes a while until we reach the more fantastic side of things. And, yeah. We start with people like Kurt Vonnegut. We have people like Umberto Eco, if you want to lump him in with the more fantastic side of things, which you certainly can do. And we then have people like Gene Wolfe, who's definitely a master of that, because they withhold the one true interpretation. But what they do is oftentimes add a ton of references, deliberately add a ton of references and symbols and stuff that you, the reader, can go and pick up on. And those you pick up on, those you connect to stuff that you have already figured out in your life because you've read other books, watched other movies, all that stuff. Those will help you create your kind of meaning. And it becomes a bit of a game of who can drop the most references and who can find the most references and shit like that. That's one thing you can do. But at the end of the day, all of these books force the reader to make up their mind what they think the book actually says, if they assume there is a meaning in that book. And that approach has a lot to offer when we think back about that. The idea is to take down and destroy authorities. And yeah, as I said, it took a while for this to end up in fantasy. You can definitely read the Malazan Book of the Fallen like that way. It clearly has main themes in there, but along the way are a lot of references, a lot of stuff that is deliberately sending the reader into all kinds of directions to discover themselves and the meaning of life in those pages for themselves, which will be different for each and every one of us reading those books, for example. And that's a wonderful thing. But there is obviously the other side, the traditional side, that does very much believe in the idea of having one meaning in there. Or maybe not even having one big meaning in there, but at least having a very clear-cut path that you go. Like, basically, the book is not like a forest with all these small animal trails and and footpaths winding around the trees and stuff. Your novel is basically a highway, where it's very clear whom to follow, whom to root for, whom to root against, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, so forth. That's very clear, and you can just like follow along, follow the author as they lead you through that one story, that one highway they have constructed as a story. And that's certainly what you see with more traditional books. I mean, your Tolkien does have it. Your Robert E. Howard does have it. A lot of other authors have it as well. And it is becoming more and more popular again. Right? Because some of the later, recent best-selling authors, I'm not going to drag in Brandon Sanderson here just because I don't like the guy, but his books are clearly that sort of book where you know fairly early on whom to, root for, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys. That stuff's pretty clear. Yes, they are sort of morally gray sometimes, at least slightly, and whatnot. There is stuff like that in there, but it's still very clear that, who's sort of the good guy and who to root for. That stuff's clear with stuff like Brandon Sanderson. It's even fairly clear with the stuff like Game of Thrones or like A Song of Ice and Fire. You kind of know who the good guys are because George R. R. Martin is telegraphing a lot of it over time. Yes, he puts in like a few like really turns where he has like, your Jamies and whatnot. He does do that a little, but it's still fairly clear. And once that one thing has happened, you're like, oh yeah, now he's a good guy. I'm fine with it. Stuff like that. It moves on. It's the same thing with all your, or most of your grimdark characters. It's fairly clear that while he's definitely a psychotic murderer when he goes into berserker rage, Logan Ninefinger is somewhat of a sympathetic character when you're reading the First Law trilogy. He is that. He fails a lot, but you know who to root for when you're reading First Law, when you're reading Abercrombie. He's not making it very difficult for you to, like or hate people. Once he actually invests, time and page count into writing those characters, which is why Pharaoh Melgen doesn't work, because he doesn't know what to do with her. An aside that wasn't really necessary. My point, however, is that for reasons that we need to look at, after postmodern fiction, got some, popularity through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and made even some inroads into fantasy, it is now, in a lot of ways, on the retreat again. And the argument here, the reason here, is obviously capitalism. And it's capitalism in, like, a twofold way. Now, the one is, obviously, people write these kind of books because these kind of books sell a lot. Which is why Brandon Sanderson is so successful. Which is why people read Brian McClellan's Powder Mage. Which is people, there's a lot of that stuff out there, which is, why you read your John Gwynne, who's the good guys in John Gwynne. Stuff like that, And, of course, people that want to write commercially will, have a strong incentive to write that kind of story. Now, the other side of that is, obviously, why do people like those kinds of stories? And I want to make it very clear, this is not me saying people that like postmodern fiction are the thinking people, the big brain people. No. Liking one of those things doesn't make you smarter than the other. What it means is that those people seem to have more time and energy to spend on doing that kind of stuff. Or are just, antagonistic bastards like me, contrary bastards like me. That's the other side of it. But the problem is that in a time and day where we all struggle through all kinds of economic, social, and whatnot pressures, where there's so much stuff out there to take our attention whenever we want. And when we come home from having worked a shit job and are exhausted already, very few of us can afford to go and sit through reading a Thomas Pynchon novel and trying to figure out what the hell the guy wants to tell us with one specific thing. Most of us can't afford that stuff. It's up to a point, it's a privilege to be able to read complicated, antagonistic fiction, because there is a sort of antagonism in there, in that kind of book. Those kind of books, those more like postmodern books, they expect the reader to wrestle. There's always a bit of a conflict between the writer and the reader, because the writer is making it not deliberately difficult to find a meaning, but to make it difficult to just find the meaning. They challenge you. There's a challenge in reading those books. And it's difficult. It's more like I have to actually actively think. And everyone can do that once they have the time and energy. And most of us don't have the time and energy to do that all the time, which is where the escapism comes in, which is where the simpler book, where the author basically takes you by the hand and leads you down that one big highway and lets you admire the scenery, and then just, kicks you out at the end with a meaning or a cliffhanger, so you go and buy the second volume of his series. So there is a clear incentive for people to read those books, and that is they are easier on the mind. And once we struggled with the difficulties of life, a lot of us just want to sit back and read that kind of thing. So we buy that kind of thing, and then other people write that kind of thing. And if we read that kind of thing all the time, and then we become writers ourselves, those will be the things that influence us. And that is why, over the last couple of decades, 2 and a bit decades, slowly, the straightforward fantasy has pushed back a lot against what you might call the more postmodern approach to fantasy in a lot of writers. And you may say, yeah, well, whatever, quality will always win. It's like, it's not that easy. It's not that easy, is it? Because there was that impetus, that reason why Barth and the postmodernists, post-structuralists wrote those essays and fought back, and that's the idea of authority. Why is that a problem? Because we should not trust authority. We should not trust the author just because they makes it easy for us to like the good guys and hate the bad guys. It makes it very difficult for us to actually question why those are the good guys and those are the bad guys. And it makes it very easy for us to just take all the things that are presented to us in a book that is written in that style. To just take all of those in and accept them as, well, seems to be good, seems to be fine. Let's just take down the Dark Lord and install a White Lord. Something that even Tolkien, conservative fan of divine right kingship that he was, kind of hinted that there's more to it, sort of, sometimes, which is why you won't give the damn ring to fucking Galadriel, but destroy the damn thing. No, my point is, I'm losing my way here. My point is that with that style of conservative, and it's a sort of conservative fiction in the way that it pushes back, and is basically built on the idea that the author knows exactly what the book has to say and makes it as simple and as clear as possible, and through that, all of these things that the author believes, that the author has read, that the author is steeped in their culture they're coming from, will suddenly be transported through that novel together with those aspects of like figuring out who the good guys and the bad guys are, because those are political choices. And that makes that kind of thing like really deceptive and dangerous in a way, because we kind of lose the practice. We lose the practice of thinking and making up our own meanings of books. We just take them in, and that's it, and believe all they say. And that's something that we get used to. And I don't know about you, but I think that's kind of scary, because one day it's just like, yeah, well, the White Knight on his white charger is riding down to save the princess, and we know he's the good guy, even though he has a broken nose and whatnot. And then, the next day, he's losing his like cloak, and we see he has like a swastika armband on his arm. The White Knight. And suddenly, 5 books deeper in, we've been like tricked into believing all kinds of abhorrent political shit, because there is another connection that we need to talk about in a different video about like an inherent conservatism in a lot of these fantasy books that goes way beyond just, using, knights and armors and whatnot. There's a darker side to that leads, is connected to the idea of having very simple, often violent solutions to problems and so forth. And violence is good if it's okay if the good guys do it and so forth. We take all of that stuff in because we trust the writer, we believe the author, we just follow them down that highway and admire the scenery and the wonderful action scenes and the really cool dialogues, and hopefully get distracted by the insanely intricate magic system, and then at the end of the day, we're in favor of tyranny as long as the tyrant is the good tyrant, and no, we shouldn't do that. Anyway, that's sort of what I wanted to talk about to you today, how that capitalist-driven, with that double-pronged idea of having the incentive to write those books because they sell, and on the other hand, having the incentive to read those books because they're easier on the mind and we need to relax and flee from like the evils of the world, leads us back into believing into authorities as long as they're nice to us, and how that leads down into like all kinds of dark shit if we're not careful, which, I don't know what to do at the end of the day, because yeah, I get it. Sometimes we really just want to escape. But maybe sometimes we should actually actively try to still make up our own minds, and even if it's very easy to find out who's the good guys and who's the bad guys in a book, we should maybe think about, like, are we doing that because the writer, the author, is telegraphing to us, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys? Or are they really? Like, we can still think about a book that's easy on the mind, that doesn't, like, deliberately punch us in the face with, like, meanings all the time and tries to lead us astray. We can do that still, and that's, like, the minimum we should do when we're reading fantasy or science fiction, because Wonderland and fairy are dangerous places, even though they may be written in bright colors. And that's something that we can learn from old school, folklore, and we should maybe keep that in mind. Anyway, I didn't talk about the metal thing, but it's the same thing. Sometimes you have like bands that insult the audience, and it's great fun because you yell abuse at each other, and afterwards all of us come out and have had that cathartic moment and are maybe a bit wiser. That's sort of my experience from watching the wonderful Dread Sovereign at Headbangers Open Air last week. And yeah, that also made me think of that whole idea of postmodern writers often being slightly antagonistic against their readers, forcing them to think whether they want to or not. And I just, wanted to mention that that's how I came up with this video idea. And yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, or tell me what an idiot I am. And I hope I didn't make my meanings too clear and you're still wondering about them, because that's helpful. So yeah, don't believe me, but enjoy the video. Like, subscribe, share, do all those wonderful things, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.